All right, good evening. It's 6:30, so we'll get started. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I'm wild. What a great crowd. So appreciate that, and thank you for asking me to come and talk about Camp Ellis. I'm sure many of you probably have stories about Camp Ellis. In fact, I heard a couple tonight of relatives that work out there. I'm sure you know stories. You know someone that worked there. You may have been out there yourself, right? Has anyone not been out there? Roaming around? A few of you? Okay. So, did anyone work there?
Dad.
Your dad. Anyone present tonight work there? Because you'd be 98 years old, so.
Maybe older than that.
Yeah. So, yeah, when it shut down, if you were 18 when it shut down, you'd be about 98. So, unfortunately, there's not a lot of people alive that worked out there in some form or another. So, why Camp Ellis for me? A couple of reasons. One is, when I was 17 years old, I started dating a young lady that lived about 1.5 miles from the entrance to Camp Ellis. And when I'd go down and visit, I would grab her dad's motorcycle and I'd kind of ride back through Camp Ellis and just kind of explore it because I didn't know exactly what it was. And what's that? Just someone? Oh, so one of my cousins found out that I was riding around back in there. I don't know if it was Daryl Buswell or Donnie Buswell, but they said, you know, Rick, there's still Japanese POWs that still live back there that's hiding out. And so when I'd ride my motorcycle back there, or his motorcycle back there, I was kind of looking over my shoulder occasionally. And I wouldn't stop because I didn't know for sure, but there were no Japanese POWs out there anyway. But anyway, and then I ended up marrying her, so she was in her backyard, you can see the water towers and that type of thing. So it's kind of a fascination for me to kind of learn more about Camp Ellis. And I found out my grandma also drove a truck for the POWs out there. She would take POWs around the area in one of the Army trucks. So I thought that was pretty neat. So hopefully, again, chime in, ask questions. I love doing these things because I learn from you. And I know there's some great stories of relatives that worked out there, and those are fascinating because unfortunately there's not a lot of people left that have those memories that can tell those stories about Camp Ellis. So I'm sure you're all aware World War II was gearing up in the United States, and there was a need for facilities to do some training. And so there was a project that was actually called the Lewistown Project originally. Why Lewistown Project? Lewistown was one of the closest bigger cities to Camp Ellis, but they also had an office there that they were doing a lot of planning for Camp Ellis. And so it started out as Camp Ellis, or Lewistown Project, and then they changed it for just a little bit to Spoon Camp Ellis, Camp Spoon River. And then as it kind of came close to opening, they changed the name to Camp Ellis. So, it's kind of interesting, again, why did they call it the Lewistown Project? But, they were kind of doing some recruiting out of the Lewistown office here. And I don't know where that office was located. Does anyone know where they kind of started the Lewistown Project here? No? Again, kind of lost history, unfortunately. So before long, again, they changed it to Camp Ellis. They changed the directive of the camp. Originally, it was going to be for infantry, foot soldiers. They were going to do some training there, but they changed it to services of supplies a little bit later as they got into planning this. So why was this location chosen? It's far away from everything, and but the short answer is because it was flat land. It was close to railroad services. They didn't have to do a lot of demolition with it. It was cheap land for them, and they didn't want distractions of large populations, so that's why they chose this area. It was named after, again, it's interesting that there's just not a lot of history out there on Camp Ellis, unfortunately. And despite the thousands of men and women that went through there, you think there would be a little more out there on Camp Ellis. But it was named after Sergeant Michael B. Ellis. He was a World War I hero. He captured 60 Germans. He knocked out 12 machine gun nests on the first day of the offense in France. So they decided to name the camp after Michael Ellis. So Camp Ellis, again, it was designed to train men in Army supply and support forces, not combat or foot soldiers. It was the only camp like it in the country. So a lot of people came, they were mainly enlisted men that came to Camp Ellis. It wasn't the draftees, it was the enlisted men. Why is that? Because if you enlisted, you kind of got your choice of what you wanted to do. You know, if you were a draftee, you were sent wherever they wanted to send you. So it was mainly enlisted men that came to train here at the Army. So it's interesting, again, you know, Camp Ellis, it accommodated a full division of soldiers. It trained over, in its life, it trained over 300,000 men to fight in the war. And it was men that they trained in Quartermaster's Corps, Medical Corps, Signal Corps, Engineering, Ordnance, Transportation, and Special Service Troops. Eventually they trained over 456 units of 56 different types of services here, ranging from large, huge contingency of engineers to small groups of men of less than a dozen men that they would deploy overseas. So this is an area of view, and I got some handouts for you to take with you. But imagine this: it's 1942, and you live in either Ipava, Table Grove, or Bernardock. And those towns, if you draw a line from Ipava to Table Grove to Bernardock back to Ipava, you know, it's kind of a left-hand triangle there. And within this triangle, those three towns was 1,100 people. That's how many people lived in those three towns back in 1942. So imagine overnight, 50,000 people showed up in this triangle, and they were living amongst you. Well, what would that do to you? What would that do to your towns? You know, probably some good things is the restaurants were busy, but you had to wait longer probably to get food, you get a table, that type of thing. But you know, the road system, you know, was clogged up a lot, and you know, again, it's just overnight. You know, you all of a sudden, it's like putting normal Illinois right there in that triangle. That's what it's like. Normal Illinois today they have about 50,000 in population. So the preliminary work started in Camp Ellis in September of '42, and the government drew up plans. They surveyed out 17,800 acres of farmland, which they purchased at the going rate. But you know, this displaced farmers and their families. They basically gave them 30 days to vacate. You know, they sent a notice and said, you got 30 days to vacate the property. And if you got crops, either take them. If you want the buildings, take those. Some people move the buildings. Some people move their homes. But you know, if you think about this, a lot of these farmlands, a lot of these farms were in the family for, you know, since the 1800s. So they not only were physically displacing people, but there was sentimental attachments, emotional attachments to these lands as well. So they swallowed up 125 farms altogether. And then later they bought on the east side of the camp, kind of in this area here, they purchased another 1,800 acres of land for their airport. That's where they built their airport. So again, a lot of families, it was difficult for them because the government didn't pay them immediately for the land. And these people had to go find another house to buy or another farm to buy, and they didn't have the cash to do it. They didn't have the means to do that. So it really put them in a hardship to do that. They did offer, you know, that we're going to buy your land at the fair market value. We're going to give you the opportunity to buy it back when we're done at some point. And you know, and they did eventually. Some families decided not to move back or buy their land back because number one, some of them moved their home. And others said, well, hey, what's going to stop you from coming back in 10 years and taking our land again? They didn't want to reinvest in something that they thought the government might take back over. So kind of some funny stories. Swamp Ellis, it was called Swamp Ellis. I have a map over there, the original map of this. Again, I'll have a handout for you on Swamp Ellis. But to complicate matters when they were building it, it was the winter of '42, which was one of the worst winters in Illinois. It was very cold, and then the spring of '43, we had a ton of rain, and there was record amount of flooding, especially like in the Illinois River and that type of thing. So they said that you could stand in mud up to your knees with dirt blowing in your face. You know, again, so in the early days, they nicknamed it Swamp Ellis. And we want to start talking about the mosquitoes and how big they were, and they were pretty bad that year as well. So Camp Ellis, meant jobs were plentiful for the area. There was a lot of construction trades that was needed in the very beginning. Ancillary items like communications, transportation, record keeping, that was all necessary. So, at Camp Ellis, they had plumbing, they had water treatment, they had sewage. Because again, imagine 50,000 people showing up in that triangle and they're using your water system and your sewer and that type of thing. That just wasn't going to happen. So they built their own water plant, their own sewer, water treatment sewer. They had phone lines, they had recreational buildings, they had kitchens, mess halls, parade grounds, headquarter facilities, roadways, postal, telegraph centers, PX facilities, shooting range, equipment depots. Pretty much everything a small town needed, that's what they had, and that's what they needed for this Army community. So, and again, you can imagine some of the economies for these small towns really exploded. Housing, there was a housing shortage because a lot of these people came and their families needed places to stay. And so it really gave an economic boom to these, especially Ipava and Table Grove. This is a picture of what the main entrance looked like off of 136. It was Route 10 at the time, but this was where you had to stop and check in. But basically it took 8 months to build this city, this small city. So from September 1942 to mid-April 43, they built more than 2,200 buildings for this camp. It was in an area roughly a third, 3.5 miles by 2.5 miles wide. So it's a very small area that they put 2,200 buildings in. So again, they were a theater of operation type buildings. They were mostly made of wood, and they had fireproof gypsumite board on it. They had 18 camp exchanges and stores that were conveniently located amongst the barracks, and I'll show you a picture of the barracks here. But they had 6 auditoriums. They built 9 chapels, which they were needed. I'll tell you about that in a minute. 2 libraries, 2 service clubs, and they had some guest houses that was built around the barracks area. So this is a picture of what a barracks looked like. Very basic. It was built on concrete blocks. There was no heat in the building. There's no running water in these barracks at all. It was dimly lit, but this is pretty much this is what it looked like. These are pictures from the actual barracks that was built out there. They had coal burning stoves that burned on each end of the barracks. That's what kept them warm in the winter. I can't imagine what it would be like in the summer, and especially back then it was extremely hot, more hot than what it is today, and then we had a lot colder winters back then. So it was probably a very pleasant place to sleep. So they did have dedication day on July 4th. This is a picture of the parade grounds. They again opened this in April 43, and it was dedicated on July 4th of 43 with the Illinois governor was there. His name was Dwight, and there was an estimated 50,000 people that showed up for dedication day. I've heard stories that the cars were lined up many miles past the Havana Bridge trying to get to Camp Ellis. It's just a lot of people were trying to get here. So when it was fully functional, it was second in population in Illinois. Chicago was #1. Camp Ellis became #2 back in 42, in the 40s there. One of the amazing feats that they had out there is called the Station Hospital. It was one of the largest World War II hospitals in the country. It occupied 140 acres. And one of its corridors was about 3,000 feet long. That's how long the corridors were. And there was 500 nurses that worked there. They attended to the sick. A lot of people came back from overseas with a lot of casualties that they would treat. The service personnel they would treat, and the prisoners of war they would treat as well. So the most notable, they had the most recent x-ray machines, surgical machines, diagnostic equipment, and they did one of the first brain surgeries out here at this hospital in our country. And again, 140 acres of a hospital is pretty large. The other interesting thing about Camp Ellis is they were home to a prototype of what they call a flying Jeep, and it known as MASH. made famous by Alan Alda and MASH, but they had MASH units. And so what they would do is they would have a group of individuals that they had equipment, they had tents, they had medical supplies, surgical tools, power generator, a Jeep outfitted as a ambulance, and the trained medical personnel. So what they would do is they would load 3 or 4 C-47 airplanes with these units, and then they would take off, they would fly around a little bit, they'd come back and land, and then they would set up their MASH units. And they did this constantly, training on how to set up these MASH units. And then they would take those individuals that was in that unit and they'd ship them overseas and help the personnel over during the war. So they practiced this routinely, the C-47s, and this is, well, I'll show you what a picture of that looks like. So Camp Ellis trained about almost every type of medical unit in operation at the time, from 11-man malaria control to survey units to 1,000-bed general hospitals and medical battalions. So this is another picture. There's a lot of these. I got a sample of one down here. But it's just kind of interesting to see the tents set up in the background. And they were out there all winter. They lived in these tents all winter, and they trained again as a unit. That was your unit. You stayed with them the whole time that you trained. They had schools for cooks, bakers, truck drivers, unrated medical personnel, surgeons, x-ray technicians, dental assistants. They had dental offices out there, pharmacy technicians. This is a picture of the bakery, and they would bake 500 loaves a day for the troops when they deployed them overseas. They would kind of cut a hole in the side of a hill, and that's where they would bake their bread. And they could make 500 bread a day, loaves of bread a day in the field. It's just kind of fun looking at some of the faces on some of these guys. But there was a salvage collection company. They were responsible for salvage of equipment and that type of thing after battles. There was a fumigation and bath company. You ever hear of a fumigation and bath company? They wanted to make sure that the troops' morale stayed high. So the first objective was to kill parasites that transmitted diseases. And the second is they improved morale by removing the annoying parasites and promoting cleanliness. So they had kind of these trailers that looked like tubs that they would deploy out into the field for the soldiers to take a bath and clean themselves during the war. So, but they trained that group here. So again, one of the other wonders of the camp is the airstrip. And workers would literally work overnight to build these airstrips. And sometimes they were 5,800 feet long by 150 feet wide. And they could do this in about 72 hours. And so what they did is, this, if you go down to Camp Ellis, the museum down there, you'll see one of these steel tracks there. But they would lay these on the flat ground out there at the airport, and that's how the planes were able to come in and take off. And then, they trained on taking off and landing like the C-47s. Like I said, that they would build it, they'd pull it up, they'd build it somewhere else, they'd pull it up, they'd build it somewhere else, because they were training and they set up a lot of airports, in various places during the war. They later added hangars out on the east side there for the airplanes, but again, they used the airstrips to help deliver supplies, officers, and other personnel. This is a picture of them laying those steel girders, the steel tracks there. So this top one is a Stetson L5. Those were the main planes that they used for practice taking off and delivery and that type of thing. They didn't have big airplanes that flew into Camp Ellis. The largest ones were these C-47s that they used for the MASH units. They could land there, and that's what they used. But most of the planes that they used for training and deliveries and that type of thing it was the smaller airplanes. Anyone been to Burning Up? So when Camp Ellis came in, they basically bulldozed Burning Up. My wife's grandmother, grandma and grandpa got a letter from the Army saying you need to vacate your house, and they ended up bulldozing all the homes there, took over Bernieback. The two reasons they did that is, one is they built the dam there, the dam that you see today. They built that because they needed to pool the water for their fresh water that they used in the camp. But the other is that they would practice building bridges across the Spoon River. Here's a picture of them building the bridge, but they would build suspension bridges, they would build pontoon bridges, even steel girder bridges, strong enough for a 25-ton load. And they would do this sometimes within 72 hours. They'd work around the clock and build these bridges. So they would build a bridge, tear it down, build a bridge, tear it down. They built over 300 bridges across the Spoon River during this time. And again, many of them went overseas and they built bridges across some of the rivers that were needed to get the equipment across. These next couple slides are postcards. I do have those up here. There are actually I'm going to say 8 official ones. There's probably 10 total of Camp Ellis. These are the linen ones, and if you want to come up and feel what it looks like, those are linen postcards. There's eight total of the linen ones, but the camp maintained large gyms where troops were formed. They formed a lot of different teams like basketball teams, boxing, physical weightlifting. They did a lot of other indoor sports. They had many baseball teams. They had bowling, tennis, volleyball, tackle, football, archery, badminton, roller skating, horseshoe pitching. But a lot of these teams they would take and they would compete against other Army camps in the Midwest, and they would also compete against other colleges throughout the Midwest. So they were very organized. They had 184 softball teams at one time, and they had 224 basketball teams at one time. Gymnasiums, athletic fields, they had film theaters, they had concert halls, libraries, places of worship. They were all over the camp. In the theaters, they had 6 theaters, and they would first run movies from Hollywood in all 6 theaters. And in a week's time, at that time, visitors were allowed to go out there and use some of those services. Unlike today, we couldn't get on a military base unless we, of course, were military. But people would come from all over and go to these theaters and that type of thing. So they had 6 theaters that they had first-run movies from Hollywood in. And they would sometimes 40,000 people in a week's time would go out there and watch a movie. They had intramural basketball, baseball, football, boxing. Again, they competed against other Army bases. A lot of times some celebrities would come, like Joe Louis came out and did an expedition. He was a boxer. The young Sugar Ray Robinson visited the camp, and it drew 25,000 people for their show that they put on. Chicago White Sox pitcher Bill Frazee came. Pro wrestler Bad Boy Brown. Anyone here of Bad Boy Brown? Those were good old times with those wrestlers. The breadbasket and all that. Bob Feller visited out here. You know Bob Feller from the White Sox. He was with the Cleveland Indians at the time. So there was a lot of celebrities sports figures that came out. This is the next 4 postcards out there. It shows a picture of the church and the theater down on the bottom here. But movie stars would come and entertain out at the camp as well. People like Red Skeleton was here, and I couldn't really verify this, but they say Bob Hope visited somewhere here, whether it was at the camp or the many USO that they had around the clubs that they had around the area. And again, it was open to visitors, and people could attend all the events. It was easy to get into. And then this is the 8th one of the postcards there. But I'm sorry, there's 9 known linen ones from Camp Ellis. The other 2 kind of came along a little bit later. This one really doesn't make sense for Camp Ellis because they didn't have these airplanes flying to Camp Ellis. So it's just like, what's that all about? And then this one came along a little bit later too, and this is the telephotograph, and it mentions Camp Ellis right here, but a lot of the other camps had the same postcard that this one did. So again, these are up here if you want to come and take a look at them afterward. The Camp Ellis News, what an amazing publication here. They published their own newspaper. It's called the Camp Ellis News. It began in April '43, and it started out as a small 4-page newspaper, and it increased its pages to over 16. And it had over 13,700 circulation, a lot more than the Daily Ledger or that type of thing. 13,000 they would produce a week. And it ceased operation just after VJ Day in August of '45. I've got, again, a handout here of Camp Ellis News. It's a 12-page one that you can go home and read, but it's interesting to read through this, these newspapers. I got some real ones, some original ones up here, but you know, it kind of gave the news of what's going on in the camp. Kind of they're dedicated to a couple pages to the sports, what's going on there, what was going on overseas with the men that were trained in Camp Ellis and now they're overseas fighting. And you know, it also got a little racy, you know, back in those days, and it got a little racist as well. So, you know, the cartoons, yeah, can't even, I can't tell you the cartoons, you can read it for yourself, but they were pretty, yeah, pretty racy at the time, but, you know, they felt that, you know, what they didn't want the guys to all work and no play, and so that's why they kind of started this newspaper. There was nothing like it. No other camp had anything like this. And then they started their own radio station. And again, there was no other Army installation that had a radio station, but it boasted an estimated 200,000 listeners a week on their radio station. And it grew so large that some of the radio stations picked up the broadcast. And there were 6 different radio stations that picked it up. And so every week they could listen to what was called the Camp Ellis Entertains, and it was a favorite listening habit of many, many people throughout central Illinois on Tuesday evenings. They even had their own fire station, you know, kind of a neat picture. I love it, you know, the old fire trucks there and the fire station. This is a picture of the water treatment and the sewer plant that they had out there. I took these pictures, I don't know, probably 6 years ago. I think they're gone now, I believe. I think they came in and removed those, didn't they? Does anyone know for sure? But, you know, it's kind of neat to go out and look at those. But they had their own telephone company. It was called Camp Spoon River. They operated it through Illinois Bell. They gave out these booklets to the soldiers. I got a sample of one of those up here as well. But it included 35 switches, over 1,000 lines operated it. And there's also a banking facility out there that was ran through Citizens National Bank of Macomb at the time. So then we got the WWII. You know about the WWII? They arrived January of '44, and they consisted of 106 women officers as well as some enlisted personnel. Some of their duties included nursing, administration, telephone operations, softball teams. They built special barracks for these young ladies. They had indoor plumbing, which is very important. But most of them transferred here from Fort Brady in Michigan. And so, you know, I talked about those chapels a little bit. So the Ellis men were very pleased that the WWII showed up. So you can kind of see a picture of them working up here on the top, and then you can see them kind of sunbathing down here at the bottom. The Ellis men really appreciated that. And there was a lot of marriages that took place out at Camp Ellis. You know, the enlisted men and the women. So there's almost wedding bells almost every week out there. So a lot of the civilian personnel that worked out there, and a lot of the WWII that worked out there, you know, a lot of them got married. You know, there was a marriage match up there with the men. The USO clubs around the area, every one of these towns around the area had a USO club that the soldiers were, especially on weekends, were allowed to leave the camp. There were several bus stations throughout the different towns that would take them to the various cities. This is a picture of the USO there in Camp not sure where it was located. There's one here in Lewistown. I was talking to, was it John, or there was one here in town, but not sure where that was located. Does anyone know?
Baldwin School.
What's that?
That's Baldwin School.
And was it?
Where the school's at now.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. Can you tell if that's what it was at one time?
I couldn't.
Yeah.
I just go with what my mom said. And
Sure.
people that age.
But you know, again, 50,000, 40,000 personnel, they needed something to do besides get married to the wax. But, and that's where a lot of the enlisted men met their wives, was through these USO clubs. And, but yeah, it's amazing how many clubs there were. But again, they needed entertainment. They needed something to do to keep them busy, because a lot of them are going to be deployed fairly soon, and who knows if they were ever going to come back. Another area of the camp that's extremely fascinating to me, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'll tell you a little bit about the POWs. They first arrived in America. They were put on trains, and what they would do is they would send them to these POW camps, kind of inside, you know, in the Midwest. There was a lot of POW camps in the Midwest. They wanted to keep them away from large metropolitan areas, and they wanted to kind of keep them isolated in these rural areas. For the most part, you know, when Camp Ellis was being planned, they did not plan on a POW camp, because again, it was just going to serve as a training camp. But they ended up adding an area. They didn't tell anybody what it was. They just started adding some barracks at a kind of a certain part of the grounds that had a guard tower, it had searchlights, and it had high barbed wire fence around it. So, and later on, then they told the troops what it was, and they eventually told the public what it was. They kept it pretty tight-lipped, because when people around the area found out there was going to be a POW camp, they didn't like it. They didn't appreciate it. They didn't want it. They didn't want anything to do with it. So the first batch of POWs came from North Africa, and it told there was about 1,000 that came originally to Camp Ellis. The camp was considered a minimum security camp. They didn't want the hard-nosed POWs coming here. But at its highest point, which was in 1944, the prison housed almost 5,000 POWs out here. Quite a bit. The camp itself, POW camp, it had a strong reputation throughout the country for its management. Washington claimed it was one of the best POW camps in the United States. So the prisoners out here, they were quite content being out here, especially from where they came from. But they were treated in strict accord to the Geneva Convention, and they had lots of food, they had housing, recreation facilities, medical care. Again, it was much better than where they came from. So at the end of the war, actually a lot of them were very reluctant to go back and leave. And many of them did come back, but they had to go. They couldn't just stay. They had to send the POWs back to their own country. But again, a lot of them came back and lived here. So the POWs, when they were under guard, they did quite a bit of manual labor inside the camp, but they'd also farm them outside the camp to a lot of farmers around the area. They helped cities do work. A lot of them went to the Washington cannery over in Washington, Illinois, and worked over at the cannery. They would send them out and help them, have them build dams, you know, for flooding, and maintain bridges and railroad tracks and that type of thing. So some of them worked outside the camp in crop production, construction, like I said, lumber yards, clothing warehouses, and a lot of them were unguarded. You know, like I said, my grandma sometimes would, from what I understand, would drive these POWs to like farms, and guards weren't with them. Those were the good POWs. There were two types of POWs. So there was actually a war going on within the walls of the camp. They were mixed with Nazi and German soldiers, the POWs. So the difference is the Nazi POWs, they were very, you know, they followed Hitler. They were very loyal to Hitler and wanted to make sure that they did everything to help the Fuhrer win the war. And then there were the German soldiers that were forced, voluntold, to join the Army. You know, they were pulled out of their homes and placed in war zones. And so they kept both of those factions out here in the camp. And so, you know, they tried to guard them as best they could, but there were, you know, some of the German soldiers were beat, you know, almost to death by the Nazi POWs. But the hardcore Nazis, they were normally either taken to another camp, because this was a minimum security camp, and they weren't allowed to work outside the camp. They were constantly guarded, and they did all the work inside the camp. But the German POWs were able to leave the camp and go work outside the camp. So the prisoners received an allowance of 10 cents per day, or 80 cents if they did volunteer work on the area farms or public works. And they were paid in, I gotta watch myself, chits. Chits with a C. They were paid with chits. It looks like these things down here. They weren't allowed to have actual cash. So they were paid with these little coupon type things called chits. These are 1 cent ones, but I'm not sure, there's a 5 cent and a 10 cent, but this is how they were paid, and they could use them in the commissary and that type of thing on camp. They couldn't use them outside the camp, but they bought their goods and candy and cigarettes and that type of thing at the camp. There were several attempts to escape. You know, again, some of them were unguarded, and some of them took advantage of that, and so, you know, but usually the ones that came from Camp Ellis, they were usually caught within a day or two. Because again, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and you got a German POW running around a small town that couldn't speak English. I think they're going to get caught pretty quickly, because they had no way of getting to the larger metropolitan areas and that type of thing. So there was never a successful escape from POW, from Camp Ellis. Now someone might say, yes, there was. There was a guy by the name of Reynold Pavel was his name, and he was stationed out at Camp Ellis, but he was transferred to Washington, Illinois, and worked in the canneries in Washington, Illinois, and that's where he escaped. And he escaped to Chicago, and he bought a bookstore up there, got married, you know, changed his name, and they finally caught him. I don't know, probably 5 years after the war was over. They finally caught him, and they made him go back to Germany, and then he just turned around and came back. But a lot of them, you know, over the years, they built some good relationships with the guards. They built good relationships with the farmers and some of the civilians that worked out at the camp. And so they maintained contact after the war. They wrote letters. Some would come back and visit. Some came back and lived. Some came back and got married to some of the local ladies and that type of thing. So it's kind of an interesting story about Camp Ellis and the POW. There were 4 deaths of POWs at the camp. This was the first one that took place. He had pneumonia and he died out at the camp. And they were buried out at what they call Dobbin Cemetery. And they gave them military rights and honors. They allowed the other POWs to do the military honors when these individuals were buried. But that was dictated by the Geneva Convention anyway, so they had to do it. So again, 4 soldiers were buried out here, but they eventually took them to Fort Sheridan and reburied them there, and then they were shipped home after the war. This is just a picture of one of the burials that took place, one of the services that took place out there with the POW, and again another one. You know, again, they had to allow the Nazi flag, you know, over the top of the Geneva Convention. They were buried out at Dobbin's Cemetery. This is a picture I took of Dobbin's Cemetery about 5 years ago. It's still out. The 3 of them are still out there. I think there were 4 total. 3 of them are still out there. You see the tombstones and that type of thing. I was able to come across some several POW type things. These are, I got 5 or 6 letters that were written home to family members. I got 2 of them up here for you to see. There's some postcards that was written back home, some letters and stuff from POWs. So even before the surrender of Germany and Japan in '45, the camp started to kind of scale back their operations, and the support units for American forces in Europe, they weren't needed as much anymore. So the last group shipped out the early part of 1945 from a modern perspective, again, it's amazing how quickly this city, the United States, assembled and deployed all these individuals in this triangle area. So in October 1st of 45, the entire camp, the land, costing a little over $23 million. It cost them about $23 million to build this camp, which is about $400 million today. They declared it a surplus. So basically they were done. The Army was done with it. The United States government was done with Camp Ellis. And so for a time, the Illinois National Guard occupied parts of the camp. This is a picture of them in the 50s when they were out there. I guess it was late 48 is when this was taken. So again, a lot of the buildings had already been sold out to civilian buyers through auctions and that type of thing. So does anyone know what this is?
Air Force.
The Air Force Base. Where is it? Colorado Springs. So in 1953, the Air Force used Camp Ellis as a survival training ground. So the Air Force did use this for a little bit. So the rumors started that the camp might become the site of a new Air Force Academy. In fact, it was being one of 3 locations that they were considered, but it ended up in Colorado Springs, where it began its construction in 1954. So again, imagine this for a moment. So you live in this triangle, 1,100 people, 50,000 people virtually come overnight, 50,000 people leave overnight, and so now you got the Air Force Academy thinking about it. And so I looked up Colorado Springs population in 1954, and it was about 69,000 people in Colorado Springs. Today, it's almost 500,000 people that live there. So can you imagine, again, if they decided to put the Air Force Base out here at Camp Ellis, what would we look like today? We would probably be a town, or would be a suburb of whatever the case might be. So if you haven't been there, it's an amazing place to visit. That chapel's amazing. I think they still let you in.
They do.
Yeah, I was probably out there about 20 years ago. But it is a neat place to visit. And then in 54, so that was 53. In 54, the Atomic Energy Commission, they planned to build a plant there, a $29 million plant, that the purpose of it was to manufacture explosive charges used in connection with atomic bombs. So they were going to put a plant out there to build these components for an atomic bomb, $29 million project. But a year later, they ended up canceling those plans. Thank goodness, I wouldn't want that plant out here. But so construction began in September 42. It opened in 43. Declared a surplus in 45. By the mid-50s, everything had been turned back over to privately held land, and all the buildings were sold off. These are some pictures of some of the remnants that you might still see out there, the water towers. There's a couple of chimneys from some of the housing and that type of thing you can still see out there. Some of the farmers turned buildings into like a barn, mini barn storage. This house here, I think the Flemings still live there. This was the general's house, what they called the general's house. It's called the White House. That's where the general of the camp lived. It's just to the east of the main entrance there. So, you know, those are some of the remnants that you'll see out there today. You'll see the firing range. They had 3 1/4 mile long concrete rifle ranges, which they still remain today, and it's quite interesting to see some of the artistic the kids. You know, a lot of kids go out there and kind of get together. Who knows what they do, but probably don't want to know what they do. But there is some very good artwork out there, and there's some very vulgar artwork out there. But I tried to get a picture of one that didn't have any obscene things in it. Have you anyone visited the Easley Museum? Great place to go. Marion, he's Mr. Camp Ellis. You know, he knows everything there is to know about Camp Ellis, and he does an amazing job there. Unfortunately, it's not open during the winter, and it's not open every day, but if you haven't been there, I would highly recommend that you visit the Easley Pioneer Museum. There's more than just Camp Ellis things there, but he continues to build that collection. So buildings were sold, lots were sold, a lot of it was sold to commercial businesses, universities, some of it was given away to universities and schools, some of it was bought by universities and schools. Western Illinois bought a lot of the barracks for housing at WIU for their student housing. A school in Plymouth purchased one of the gymnasiums and they moved it there. It is still standing there. It's not in good shape, but it still stands there. Some area churches turned buildings into dormitories. One of the interesting stories is monks from Iowa monastery came over and they bought all the water treatment and a lot of the pumps and that type of thing, and took it back to Iowa. Other buildings went to use as homes, museums, storage facilities throughout central Illinois, and again, they donated a lot of it. This church that was out there, this chapel, is actually still standing in Peoria Heights, is still being used today. But this is in Peoria Heights. This, anyone see this place? This is just outside of Good Hope. Those were barracks that they used. They're now duplexes, so they're in Good Hope. So the last piece of land was sold on April the 26th, 1955. Every piece of land went back to private ownership on April 26th of 1955. And so this is what Camp Ellis looks like today in all its vastness. You know, truly a city built overnight and vanished the next. So again, as I said, there's not a lot of, you don't find a lot of information out there. In fact, even if you do AI, they're very vague on some of the things. So so the knowledge out there is hard to come by. You know, there were 5 books that on Camp Ellis, and I'll kind of tell you about these. This is the first one, the story of Camp Ellis. This was back in the 40s. You know, the Army wrote this book, and it has a lot of good history, a lot of neat pictures about Camp Ellis. So this is the first book on it. Let's see, Charlie Parkinson. I don't think he's alive anymore, is he? Yeah. So this is his book, and basically he's got a couple of paragraph commentary, but basically what he did is he took and reproduced this book and put it into this book. So that's one. Ron Stevenson, you've probably seen this one. He's got some history of Camp Ellis in here, not a lot. Basically, he came to the area in '49. His dad was in the National Guard, and he was, I don't know, 8th grade or something like that. So he wrote a book about kind of his experience walking around out there in the old camp, and it's more about his basketball days when he was playing basketball for Ipava, that type of thing. And then we got Margie Bordner. This is a pretty neat book. She also reproduced the original book, is in here, but she also has some good commentary. And the neat thing, what she did was she asked people to send her letters, people that were out there, that served out there, that worked out there. She asked them to send letters about their experience out there. And her husband was stationed out there, and she worked out there. So she's got some good, a pretty good article about the two of them. But you know, it's pretty neat that you know some of the experiences that took place out there amongst the people that were there. And then recently Mary Kerr, she was from Washington, she wrote a book, Camp Ellis, POW. She wrote 2 books. Her first one was on Washington's home front and POWs, because again, her family owned the cannery over in Washington, and POWs worked there. So she wrote a book about Washington, the cannery, the POWs, and then she did write one about the POWs in Camp Ellis. Probably about a third of it deals with Camp Ellis, and the rest she kind of went back to Washington. But it's a good book to read. And then there was a 2, 4, 5, 6 one that came along a couple years ago. It's called Camp Ellis, Once a City Not Forgotten. I helped Mary Haney write this book. Mary Haney was born and raised in St. David, and she started working there from day one at Camp Ellis, and she was there till the last day when they sold everything off. So this is a book, basically it's a story of her life, kind of interesting where she came from, history of St. David, Ipava, Lewistown, those types of things. But there's a lot of history about Camp Ellis. There's a lot of colored pictures in it, again, this is a book that Mary and I wrote together. So those are the only books that I know of on Camp Ellis, unfortunately. So and this is a picture of Mary. She passed away in 2020. Amazing woman. She was 95 when she passed away. But she was so full of energy. So what I have up here for you to watch, look at, I've got an original pennant. These are the POW letters, postcards, the postcards from Camp Ellis, the books. These are pillowcases. There's a ton of pillowcases out there, but to wives, to brothers and sisters, to kids, that type of thing. So those are pillowcases that they would send home. Picture of Swamp Ellis, the lay of the land, the newspapers, and this is a picture of Dedication Day, one of the original pictures of the Dedication Day. And just two other things. This says Camp Ellis, Lewistown, Illinois. Supposedly the POWs made these. These are like an envelope thing. When I bought this, I was told it was from a guard in the POW camp out there, Billy Club, I think. Grandpa like that. This is a ticket book. The police out there, the MPs, they gave traffic violations to people. So, again, I got tons of handouts for you if you want those. So, that's my story. Any questions?